I just want to open up by quoting the great Marxist theoretician Karl Marx, who said in 1845, quote, "The ideas of the ruling class are in every epoch the ruling ideas. That is, the class which is the ruling material force of society is at the same time its ruling intellectual force. The class which has the means of material production at its disposal has control at the same time over the means of mental production, so that thereby, generally speaking, the ideas of those who lack the means of mental production are subject to it. The ruling ideas are nothing more than the ideal expression of the dominant material relationships grasped as ideas," end quote. So in other words, even though this was written over 200 years ago, close to 200 years, his words are very, very relevant today, because really what he's saying is that the dominant ideas of any period are the ideas of those who are in power, those who own the means of production, be it industrial or service sectors, and they have at their disposal to dispense their prejudiced ideas, that is the bourgeois media and culture, to keep social order, meaning their rule over the workers and the oppressed, keeping them at the bottom. And the beauty of Marxist theory is that it continues to apply to all contemporary ideas and issues, including the current condition for black people, which is rooted in the unfinished revolution that began after the Civil War with black reconstruction for millions of former enslaved people really struggling to win bourgeois democratic rights on the par of whites for the most part. This radical period of about 10 years was violently cut short by a terrorist counter-revolution led by the former slaveocracy with the complicity of the federal government. The founding of Black History Month is an important concession rooted in this ongoing struggle. Much of Black History Month, however, has been negatively skewed by the U.S. in the minds of the U.S. masses due to the various institutions that reflect a biased ruling class. Let's first look at the economic aspects of this, and then the political aspects. Black History Month has been reduced to a shameful tool, as Pat was saying in her talk, for making profits at all costs. This is nothing more than blatant opportunism and exploitation. For instance, when we were coming back from the Nelson Mandela tribute at Riverside Church, some of us are in the car and we noticed this huge Macy's department billboard. And what it was doing is promoting a humongous advertisement that says, quote, "Black History Month. Join our celebration to 10 decades of cultural defining African American styles. Come celebrate, get inspired, feel empowered," end point, in the quote. And this is the same Macy's that just announced a new round of layoffs of 3,000 workers, and I'm sure a lot of those workers are black and people of color. In 2005, the Washington Post article called "Black History and Ads Don't Mix," activists say, end quote. There were ads in Jet and Ebony magazines on Black History Month from Ford Motors, which stated, quote, "Henry Ford recognized the value of a skilled workforce, regardless of race. And when Ford became the first major corporation to pay African American workers equal pay for equal work, it helped give birth to the black middle class." Ford spokesman Mitchell Johnson said, "The firm was among the first to hire blacks into high-paying jobs, helping to spur the migration of African Americans from the South to the North. We want to be out there on the forefront because our heritage of supporting the communities we do business with," he said, end quote. Now this is the same Ford who founded the segregated cities of Inkster, quote unquote, for black workers, and Dearborn for whites, which is now presently mainly an Arab and Muslim immigrant neighborhood of Detroit. And of course, most of us know that Ford was a well-known Nazi sympathizer.
Right.
And of course, we all know what the situation in Detroit is today. Not only for black workers, who were the last hired, first fired, but for all the workers. They just announced today the slashing of pensions by 34% for the retirees of Detroit, which is really a genocidal act. It's criminal. We're going to be writing about that in Workers' World. Now, Payless stores actually promoted, this is really something, I believe I have a dream charm necklace. Yes, to profit off of Dr. King's historic speech at the 1965 March on Washington for Jobs and Freedom. These are just a few of the examples, but many of the Fortune 500 corporations, including those who employ low-wage workers, and also, of course, are non-union, exploit Black History Month. These include McDonald's, Burger King, Verizon, Target, Kmart, American Airlines, Walmart, and the list goes on and on. So let's look at the political side. The capitalists have notoriously picked and chosen which black figures or even mass struggles that should be celebrated in the minds of the masses and which should be marginalized, shunned, or forgotten altogether. What immediately came to my mind is how the history books demonize the militant anti-slavery fighters like Nat Turner and John Brown as being quote-unquote fanatical or crazy, or how Denmark Vesey and Gabriel Prosser, who led heroic rebellions against their slave masters, are marginalized or erased from the bourgeois history books. Marcus Garvey, the founder of the Universal Negro Improvement Association, a million people strong worldwide movement which promoted the Back to Africa movement, was politically targeted because he dared to promote the right of black people to separate from their racist oppressors. He was illegally deported to England, where he eventually died there in 1940. And the UNIA to this day is still on record, I think the largest mass movement of black people in US history. And Garvey and his followers were vilified for carrying out in practice the Leninist view of self-determination of oppressed peoples, including, the right to separate. And supporting and defending this right is the acid test of any revolutionary party, and especially if that party is based in an imperialist country like we are in the United States. But unfortunately, back during Garvey's time, prominent socialist groups denounced the Garveyite movement as being anti-assimilationist. And as a result, this chauvinist, erroneous position set back class solidarity based on the struggle against racism and national oppression. The bourgeois history books also like to downplay the historical role of African American women, like Ida B. Wells, who was a leader of the anti-lynching campaigns, and civil rights pioneers like Ella Baker and Fannie Lou Hamer, in which Comrade Albayumi wrote wonderful articles about both of these women in our paper. And in 1965, I wrote an article for Workers' World on, quote, how women led and won the Montgomery bus boycott, based on the wonderful book that was written by Joanne Robinson, who was a founder of the Women's Political Council. In part, Robinson wrote in the aftermath of Rosa Parks being arrested for refusing to give up her seat on a segregated bus, and this is a quote, she said that the Women's Political Council will not wait for Mrs. Parks' consent to call for a boycott of city buses. On December 2nd, 1955, the women of Montgomery will call for a boycott to take place on Monday, December 5th, end quote. And it was because of the Women's Political Council, through their mass outreach and the meetings that were held, that eventually formed the Montgomery Improvement Association, in which then Dr. Martin Luther King was elected president, which proved to be the engine behind the economic bus boycott, which resulted in a historic victory of desegregating the buses and providing a spark for the modern-day civil rights movement. And we can't forget the co-opting of Dr. King's and Malcolm X's legacies. In fact, today marks the 49th anniversary of the assassination of Malcolm X. And next year will be the 50th anniversary of his assassination, which is going to be a major, event. But these were the two most prominent black political leaders in the 1960s. A few years ago, I'm sure Johnny knows about this, a postal stamp honoring Malcolm X was unveiled during Black History Month in Baltimore. And this is the same U.S. Postal Service that is closing hundreds of post offices around the country, mainly in the black and poor communities. And while King and Malcolm were on the opposite sides of the political, ideological barricades, especially where the tactic of nonviolence was concerned, there were similarities between the two that were not lost on the 1% or the ruling class. Both King and Malcolm supported reparations for people of African descent. Both of them were evolving politically and ideologically in terms of their worldview, of linking the economic and political issues to the bankruptcy of capitalism. And despite their different approaches to the struggle, they were equally targets of the FBI's repressive COINTELPRO, starting in the 1950s. And both were indirectly assassinated by the US government. And even before Malcolm X was developing an anti-capitalist perspective, he was in the forefront of advocating revolutionary black nationalism, especially the right to self-defense, and also self-determination to win the liberation of black and all oppressed people. And this was the real meaning of his by any means necessary message. In fact, the Black Panthers credit Malcolm X for their view and their formation based on the right of armed self-defense in relationship to police terror. The Panthers were also proponents of dual power, as they exposed the inability of the capitalist government to meet the needs of the black community by establishing free breakfast programs, free health care clinics, free liberation schools, and much more. They followed the teachings of Marx and Lenin and Mao Zedong, Ho Chi Minh, and many other leaders. The Panthers were beloved throughout the urban black centers and respected throughout many sectors of the revolutionary movement. They were attracting so many young black revolutionaries to their party that the FBI and other agencies went after them in a genocidal tirade of assassinations of top leaders like Fred Hampton. They also, they infiltrated the Panthers with informants, the false imprisonments, and of course the race, all within the framework of racist demonization. FBI Director J. Edgar Hoover labeled the Panthers as, quote, the greatest threat to the national security of the U.S. as a precursor to exterminating them. The Panthers were the highest organizational expression of black liberation. They inspired other revolutionary groups, also targeted by the FBI, like the Deacons for Self-Defense, the Puerto Rican-led Young Lords, and of course the indigenous American Indian movement. And our party, especially under the banner of Youth Against War and Fascism, were amongst the most consistent and militant defenders of the Panthers, especially against state repression. But just to get back to King and Malcolm, of course they both made a lot of significant speeches, that hardly get raised or mentioned in any of the mainstream, bourgeois press. For instance, while King's I Have a Dream speech is so iconic, his speech in 1967 on the war in Vietnam called Beyond Vietnam, A Time to Break the Silence, end quote, was a significant turning point for him and the ruling class, who really tolerated him up to that point. In that speech, he condemned the U.S. as, quote, the greatest purveyor of violence in the world. And he also stated, quote, when the bombs are dropped in Vietnam, they explode in our communities, end quote. In this speech, where he linked the issues of war abroad with the social inequality at home, King's views reflected his disenfranchisement and disenchantment with capitalism, even with its moralistic overtones. He called for the U.S. to pay reparations to the Vietnamese people, where he really just really laid out many of the U.S. atrocities against them. The bourgeoisie and the government could not tolerate this anymore from King. And just as on the eve of the Poor People's March that was supposed to take place in the summer of 1968, but they decided that, enough was enough and he had to be exterminated. He had clearly become a real threat to the stability of capitalist relations because he overstepped his bounds by entering into the arena of U.S. foreign policy. Comrades and friends, Black history includes in commemorating all the great achievements of people of African descent who are political activists or entertainers or scientists, etc. That's very important in terms of education. But as Marxist communist revolutionaries, we must always think of historic events like Black History Month, International Women's Day, or May Day as vehicles to help push forward the class struggle, to help raise political consciousness with the goal of building class solidarity, first and foremost on an anti-racist basis. The historic election of the first Black president in 2008 did not signal a post-racial society, which many people were hoping for and dreaming for. It has become even more apparent that capitalist relations are more entrenched today since Obama was elected than before, due to the irreversible, permanent global capitalist economic crisis. And Black people, like immigrants, remain as super exploited or oppressed nations within an exploited working class. And I have a lot of statistics that I was going to raise in terms of, showing this disproportionate number of how Black people are being so super exploited, in the area of employment, in terms of health care, etc. But maybe I can mention some of those during the discussion. But I just want to end up by saying that our task as a revolutionary Marxist party is to support the ongoing struggle for liberation while we continue to strengthen our ranks for our ultimate goal of overthrowing capitalist relations inside the U.S. to be replaced by a socialist society based on meeting the needs of human beings and the planet. Only through socialist revolution will all of our class sisters and brothers be truly liberated from capitalism, including women, LGBTQ people, immigrants, the disabled, and many others. In the long run, only socialist revolution can ensure that Black people and other oppressed people win their full democratic rights. But to reach this goal, we must continue to find ways to intervene against the banks, as we are doing in Detroit, with the debt crisis, and how this debt crisis has been imposed upon the backs of the workers, the foreclosures and social services, which is really a blueprint of what they want to do in every city and town. What is happening with Detroit is very similar to what the IMF and World Bank have done around the world in imposing austerity and cutbacks on whole countries like in Africa, Asia, and Latin America, and the Middle East. And of course now we see in a former, socialist bloc in Eastern Europe. Our party will continue to build solidarity with the fast food, underpaid workers via the People's Power Assemblies and the Workers' Assemblies to demand a $15 an hour minimum wage, the right to organize and for full benefits. Our party will continue to fight imperialist wars abroad throughout, Africa and Asia, Latin America, in the Soviet Union, like Ukraine, in the Middle East, and of course the racist war at home on youth of color, whether it's police terror, mass incarceration, lack of jobs and education, to demand the freedom for all political prisoners like Mumia, Leonard Peltier, all of the Cuban Five, Russell Maroon Schultz, who just got out of solitary confinement after 22 years. He's still in prison, but he's out of solitary confinement. Oscar Rivera Lopez, and hundreds more. And the more that we intensify our clarion call for global class solidarity by putting Marxist theory into practice, we will win the most class-conscious fighters to the movement and to our ranks of all nationalities. To quote the great anti-slavery fighter Frederick Douglass, "Without struggle, there is no progress." Long live the true revolutionary legacy of Black History Month. Build a workers' world. Thank you.